Maggie had always been a dog person. Growing up in the quiet countryside of Georgia, her family had owned several dogs, large, imposing creatures that were almost as much a part of the land as the oak trees and rustling fields. When she moved into the city after college, she felt an odd pang of homesickness. Her apartment, with its sleek modern design and sterile corners, was a far cry from the sprawling house she had grown up in. After a few months, she began to feel the weight of the loneliness. The hum of city traffic, the endless parade of strangers, and the buzz of her computer screen at all hours left her restless. The emptiness in the apartment was a constant, gnawing presence. That's when she decided she would adopt a dog. She didn't know what had drawn her to the shelter on that rainy October afternoon. Maybe it was the deep longing for companionship or the stories of sheltered dogs needing second chances. Or maybe it was the desperate desire to fill the hollow space that seemed to echo louder each night. The shelter was quiet, and the air smelled of old wood, bleach, and pet food. As she walked down the rows of cages, Maggie felt a strange unease settle in her chest. The dogs, each one wagging its tail or looking up expectantly, seemed almost too eager to be chosen. She knew she would find one that suited her, one that would become her companion and, eventually, her family. It was then that she saw him. He was in the farthest corner of the shelter, in a cage much larger than the others. His coat was dark, matted in some places, and his fur seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His eyes, though, were what caught her attention. They were large and round, an eerie yellowish hue that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the shelter. They locked onto hers with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, motionless, watching her. "That's Max," the shelter worker said, appearing behind her. "He's been here a while. Not many people want him. He's different." Maggie hesitated. Different how? "He's quiet," the worker said with a soft chuckle. "Doesn't bark much, and he's a bit standoffish. But he's not dangerous, if that's what you're wondering." Maggie looked back at the dog. His eyes never left hers, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. He wasn't barking or wagging his tail like the others. Instead, he just stood there, staring, almost as if he were waiting for something. Something from her. A strange chill ran down her spine. Despite her hesitation, something inside her urged her to go closer. She knelt down in front of the cage, extending her hand slowly. Max didn't move. His gaze remained fixed and wavering. "I'll take him," Maggie said quietly, more to herself than to the worker. That night, Maggie brought Max home. The apartment felt different with him there, quieter, more comforting somehow. He didn't bark or whine, not even when she left the room to prepare her dinner. He simply followed her around silently, sitting at her feet and watching her with those eyes that seemed to see everything. The first few nights passed without incident. Max slept at the foot of her bed, curling up into a tight ball. Sometimes, Maggie would wake in the middle of the night to find him sitting on the floor beside her, just staring at her. But she chalked it up to his adjustment to a new home. He was a rescue, after all. He had probably been through a lot. But soon, she began to notice small things, odd things. It started with the scratching. At first, she thought it was just Max getting accustomed to the apartment, pawing at the walls or the floor out of nervousness. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't at the door like she expected. It was at the walls, the floors, and sometimes even the ceiling. It was as if Max were trying to dig his way through the apartment, clawing at something just beyond her reach. One night, Maggie woke to the sound of its scritch, scritch, scritch coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. She got up, groggy and irritated, and opened the door. There was Max, standing perfectly still in the dark, his eyes glowing faintly as he stared at her. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. The scratching had stopped. "Max," she called softly, stepping into the hallway. No response. When she reached out to touch him, his fur felt damp, cold even. She flinched, pulling her hand back. Her pulse quickened. "Max," she repeated, a little more firmly this time. "What's wrong?" He still didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed deeper, thicker than they should have been. There was something in those shadows, something wrong. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she swore she saw the faintest outline of something slithering across the floor, just beyond the reach of the dim hallway light. She blinked, and it was gone. Suddenly, Max turned his head, locking eyes with her again. The feeling of dread intensified. His stare was piercing, almost hungry. Then, in the silence, he slowly backed away, his gaze never leaving hers, and retreated into the living room. Maggie stood frozen for a moment, her heart beat loud in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She shook her head and returned to bed, telling herself it was just a bad dream or some trick of the mind. But the next day, things only grew worse. Max began to act stranger. He would bark at nothing, his body rigid and tense, eyes fixed on corners of the room that were empty. He would growl low in his throat, the sound vibrating through the apartment, and sometimes, if Maggie tried to approach, he would snap at her just once, a sharp, warning bite. And then, the whispers began. It started softly, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside her window. But it was always when Max was around, always when he was in the room. Quiet, unintelligible voices. Maggie would sit at her desk, her fingers frozen over the keyboard, hearing it in the back of her mind, a murmur, a hiss. But when she turned around, Max would be staring at the wall, or pacing, his ears flat against his skull. One night, Maggie couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the scratching, Max's unnerving behavior, it was all too much. She decided she would take him back to the shelter. Whatever was happening, it was beyond her ability to understand. But when she tried to leave, she found the door was locked. She knew she had left it unlocked when she came in. The key wouldn't turn. Panic set in. She ran to the window, but it too was sealed shut, no matter how hard she tried to push it open. That's when she heard it scritch, scritch, scritch coming from beneath the floorboards. She dropped to her knees, placing her ear against the cold wood of the floor. The scratching was moving, frantic now, racing beneath the surface as if something was trying to break through. And then, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of whispers. Low, guttural, indistinct, and underneath them, a voice she recognized. Max's voice, but it wasn't quite his. Come closer, it whispered, its tone a vile distortion of the calm, loving voice Maggie had heard just hours before. With trembling hands, Maggie reached for the flashlight in the drawer and shone it at the floor. The beam illuminated nothing but dust and wood grain. She backed away, her mind racing. Was this real, or was she losing her mind? She turned to look at Max, but he was gone. The apartment was empty, eerily, suffocatingly empty. A sound from the hallway stopped her. A slow, deliberate scratch, followed by a deep, low growl. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. This time, she wasn't sure if it was Max behind the door, or something far worse. The growling grew louder, more frenzied, and the whispers echoed in her ears, getting closer. She backed up, bumping into the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she clutched the flashlight. In a burst of terror, she turned to flee, but the door slammed shut in front of her with a force that sent her to the ground. And there, in the darkness, she saw the glowing eyes of Max staring at her from the shadows. But they weren't his eyes anymore. They were something else. They were watching her, waiting for her. And she knew, in that moment, that the thing in the dark wasn't just a dog anymore. It had never been. In a small town, nestled between hills and thick woods, there was a family who had just moved into an old Victorian house. It wasn't the grandest home in the neighborhood, but it was large, with sweeping staircases and high ceilings. The kind of house that seemed to come alive at night, creaking floors, rattling windows, and strange drafts that no one could explain. For the Parkers, the house was the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. There was Paul, the father, a quiet and reserved man who worked from home as a software engineer. Claire, his wife, was a nurturing woman, often at home tending to the house and their two children. Emma, a 7-year-old girl, and 5-year-old Ethan. They also had two pets, a golden retriever named Max and a black cat called Shadow. From the moment they moved in, something felt off. Not wrong, but off. Like a constant hum of unease, like something was watching or waiting. The family chalked it up to the stress of the move and the overwhelming nature of settling into a new place. But the house had its secrets, and the longer they stayed, the more the walls seemed to whisper. It began with Max. He was a cheerful, loyal dog, playful, always wagging his tail, always by the kid's side. But after a few weeks, he started acting strangely. He would bark at empty corners of the room, his tail wagging in frantic circles, before suddenly freezing and staring into the space, his body tense. Claire thought it was just an overactive imagination, perhaps a squirrel outside the window or a passing car. But then Max began to refuse to enter certain rooms. The living room, the hallway leading to the basement, and especially the attic door. At night, Max would whine softly, standing at the base of the stairs, his eyes fixed on the attic door as though something inside was calling to him. Claire, worried for her dog's well-being, chalked it up to strange noises or the house settling. But even when she called Max up to bed with them, he would hesitate before slowly making his way upstairs, his ears flat against his skull. Shadow, the cat, was more aloof than Max, but Claire noticed that the cat, too, was acting peculiar. Shadow would sit in the darkest corners of the house, her green eyes gleaming, and stare at the walls, her body stiff with an intensity that unnerved Claire. Sometimes, Shadow would sit by the attic door, scratching at it lightly with her claws, her tail flicking as though trying to get something's attention. Claire dismissed it at first as the cat's strange habits, but when she found Shadow sitting on the attic steps late one night, just staring up, she began to wonder. And then came the whispers. It started quietly, like a faint murmur that could have been the wind or creaking floorboards. But night after night, they grew louder, more distinct. They sounded like ... voices, faint, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from beneath the floor, underneath the old wooden beams. Sometimes it was a low hum, other times it sounded like laughter, like children playing, but there was something wrong with it. It was too high-pitched, too fast. The first night Claire heard it, she thought it was just the house settling. But when the whispers didn't stop, when they grew louder and more persistent, she couldn't ignore it. She asked Paul, but he only shrugged it off. "Old houses make strange noises," he said. "It's probably just the wind." But Claire wasn't so sure. There was something wrong in this house. The kids didn't seem to notice at first. Emma, who had always been imaginative, talked about seeing things out of the corner of her eye, shadows darting behind furniture, a quick movement in the hallway. Ethan, on the other hand, started to complain about bad dreams. He would wake up crying, claiming that something was under his bed, something that whispered to him in the dark. "I don't like it, Mom," Emma said one evening after dinner, her voice small. "There's something in the attic. It's not ... good." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's like something is up there, watching us," Emma said, her little fingers tapping nervously on the table. Paul dismissed it as just childhood imagination, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's words were more than just that. It was one particularly stormy night when everything changed. The wind howled outside, rain pelting against the windows, and the house creaked and groaned under the pressure. Claire had gone upstairs to check on the kids, and as she walked down the hallway, she passed the attic door. She paused, her hand lingering on the brass handle. The whispers were louder now, insistent, rising from the floorboards, as though something was trying to claw its way out. She opened the door and hesitated. The attic was dark, but she could make out the shapes of old trunks, boxes, and forgotten furniture. She stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop immediately. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something ancient had settled here. Her eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where a large, old rug covered the floor. But the edges of the rug were ... lifted. She bent down, her heart racing, and pulled it back. What she saw made her blood run cold. Beneath the rug was a trapdoor. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, like voices urgently calling her name. Her breath quickened. She backed away from the trapdoor, her mind racing. She knew she shouldn't open it. She knew it, but something drew her in. A pull she couldn't explain. Slowly, as if in a trance, Claire crouched down, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the trapdoor and slowly lifted it. The cold air from below rushed up to meet her, and she could smell something foul like old earth, decay, and rot. And then she saw it, a small, narrow crawl space beneath the house, dimly lit by some unseen source. In the middle of the space was a large, wooden crate. It was old, much older than the house itself. And it was ... moving. Claire gasped. Something was inside it. The whispers became louder, more insistent, calling her closer. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, the air thick with something malignant. She reached out a trembling hand toward the crate. And then, the moment she touched it, the whispers stopped, dead silence. The air felt suffocating now, as if something was watching her, something old and hungry. Claire pulled back, her heart racing, but before she could step away, a low, guttural growl echoed from beneath the floor. Max, her dog, was at the attic door, his fur standing on end, his eyes wide with terror. Claire ran to him, grabbing his collar and pulling him away, but not before a single, clawed hand shot up from the trapdoor, pale, withered, and covered in dirt. It gripped the edge, pulling itself slowly out of the hole. With a scream, Claire yanked Max away, slamming the trapdoor shut. The house seemed to groan with the force of something restless below. That night, the whispers didn't stop. They followed Claire through every room, clawing at her, echoing in the walls. Max refused to leave her side, his body trembling with fear, and even Shadow hid under the couch, her fur bristling, her eyes wide. The Parkers left the house the next morning. Years later, when the house was sold again, no one ever mentioned the whispers or the strange crate. But the new owners and older couple did report unusual things. The dog they adopted suddenly going missing, their cat acting erratically, and at night, the sound of scratching from beneath the floor. But the attic door, it was always locked, and no one ever went up there again. The Willows had always been a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Tall oak trees lined the streets, and the houses were spread far apart, their backyards lush with gardens and hedges. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside, until the streetlights flickered on. For Sarah and Tom, it was the perfect place to settle down and raise a family. They had 2 children, Olivia, a quiet 9-year-old who loved reading, and 7-year-old Luke, who was always full of energy. And then there was Bella, their 6-year-old golden retriever, and Whiskers, their cat, a sleek, gray tabby with a temperament as unpredictable as the weather. For the first year or so, everything was perfect. The family settled into their new life, and their pets brought them comfort and joy. Bella would run through the backyard, chasing after tennis balls, and Whiskers would curl up on the couch, purring contentedly at Sarah's feet as she read in the evenings. But then, it started. It was subtle at first, just little things. Bella began to growl at the door to the basement, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within her chest. She wasn't usually the type to act aggressive, but there were moments when Sarah would hear that growl. Soft at first, and then louder, more insistent. Whiskers, too, started behaving oddly. He would sit on the stairs at night, staring down at the basement door with wide, unblinking eyes, his ears flat against his head. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off. The house was old, nearly 100 years old. In fact, 10 old houses creaked and groaned in ways that could easily spook animals. But the unease started to grow. One night, Sarah was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, watching the quiet flicker of the TV. The house was still, save for the occasional rustle of the leaves outside. The children were asleep upstairs, and Tom had gone on a business trip. She glanced down at Whiskers, who was curled up beside her on the couch, his tail flicking nervously. Bella was at the door again, her nose pressed against the wood, staring at the basement. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Not this again, girl," she muttered, standing up to let the dog outside. But as she reached for the door handle, she froze. There was a faint scratching noise coming from the basement. Soft at first, but growing louder, like something was clawing at the wooden steps beneath. It wasn't the house settling, she realized with a shudder. The scratching was deliberate. Her heart began to pound as she glanced down at Bella, who was now whining softly, her ears flat against her head. Whiskers leapt from the couch, his body tensed, his fur standing on end. The room felt colder somehow, the silence pressing in. "Hello," Sarah called softly, but her voice faltered. No response. She walked slowly toward the basement door, the scratching continuing, a rhythmic scrape that sent chills down her spine. The house seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer. She reached for the door handle and, without thinking, pulled it open. The basement was pitch black. The light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting eerie, erratic shadows on the walls. There was no sound now, no scratching, just the stillness of the dark. "Who's there?" Sarah said, her voice trembling as she peered into the abyss of the basement. Nothing answered. Bella stood rigidly beside her, staring into the darkness. Whiskers, too, hovered just behind her, his eyes wide and reflective in the dim light. They weren't acting like their usual selves, they were scared. Something was down there, and they knew it. She backed away slowly, pulling the door shut with a quiet click. Her hands were shaking as she locked the door, but when she turned around, she saw that Whiskers was already gone. "Whiskers," she called, glancing around the room. She checked the kitchen, the hallway, but the cat was nowhere to be found. "Whiskers," she called again, her voice rising with panic. When he didn't answer, she hurried upstairs to the bedrooms. Olivia and Luke were both sound asleep in their beds, the blankets tucked tightly around them. There was no sign of Whiskers. Then she heard it. A faint mewling noise coming from behind the basement door. The same noise she had heard the night before. She stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. The mewling was unmistakable Whiskers. Without thinking, Sarah rushed to the door again, her heart hammering in her chest. She twisted the lock and yanked it open. The basement was just as dark as before, but this time she swore she could hear the soft, panicked scratching from deep within the shadows. "Whiskers," she called, stepping cautiously down the stairs. The air was damp, colder than it should have been for a summer night. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't stop herself. The basement seemed endless, the shadows pooling at the edges of the room. But then, just as she reached the bottom, she saw him. Whiskers, sitting motionless in the far corner of the basement. His eyes glowed in the darkness, fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "Whiskers," she breathed, relief flooding through her. But as she stepped forward, she froze. There was something wrong with the way he was sitting. His body was unnaturally still, his fur matted with something dark. And then, with a sudden, terrifying jolt, Whiskers twisted his head around, his neck jerking in a way that wasn't natural, his eyes now wide and unblinking. Sarah staggered back, her breath caught in her throat, as Whiskers let out a sound, a low, guttural growl. Not the soft mewing she was used to, but something darker, more animalistic. "Whiskers, stop it," she whispered, stepping backward, but the cat wasn't listening. His body seemed to contort as if he were being pulled by some invisible force, the unnatural sounds coming from his throat growing louder. And then, before her very eyes, his form shifted. It was as though something was using the cat's body like a puppet, stretching and twisting the animal in ways that made Sarah want to scream. The fur seemed to change color, darkening, and his claws longer now scratched against the concrete floor with a sickening, scraping sound. Before Sarah could react, the growling ceased, and the cat's body fell still. It lay on the floor, lifeless, its green eyes open and staring, but something about them had changed. They were no longer the familiar, soft eyes of her pet. A voice, soft, low, and almost human, whispered from behind her. "Leave, now." Sarah spun around, her heart racing. But there was nothing there, nothing but the darkness. Bella's frantic barking echoed from upstairs. Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening in her ears. That night, the family packed up and left. They didn't tell anyone why. They couldn't explain it. Not the way the animals had acted, not the way the house had felt like it was alive, like it was suffocating them. The Willows didn't stay empty for long, but the next family that moved in didn't last more than a few months. Their cat, too, had begun to behave strangely, and their dog had started barking at the basement door. And still, no one really spoke of it. They just moved on, and the house was sold again and again, as the whispers grew louder. Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And if you have similar stories you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.